The first theory is this theory of social penetration, which a big component of that is the self-disclosure. So the theory is called the theory of social penetration, but self-disclosure is a part of that. So the theory of social penetration proposes that as relationships develop, interpersonal communication moves from relatively shallow, non-intimate levels to deeper, more intimate, more stable levels of disclosure. The theory also states that the relationship development occurs primarily through the self-disclosure, which is the voluntary telling of intimate details. So intentionally revealing more and more personal information is the process of self-disclosure, and it's through that process that you develop feelings of connection and intimacy with others. So essentially, self-disclosure is the major way to bring a relationship from the superficial, non-connected level to the deeply connected level. And there are 4 layers roughly, and again, these aren't real. They're just kind of like ways to think about it. So the outer layer is called the orientation layer. That's the public self, the image that you portray to people kind of without any risk, right? This is just like basic stuff that you don't mind sharing. Then there's what we call the layer of exploratory affective exchange. You might broaden the amount of topics that you discuss, but generally you're still kind of talking about the public self. And this is the point at which you just to dip a toe in the water to see if you can trust people with revealing more aspects of yourself. Then there's the layer called the affective exchange layer, and this is the one that's just outside your core layer. And here it's like more about your private self, more about your intimate information, and you're still at the layer where like you casually disclose spontaneous information. And then at the very center is the layer called stable exchange. And this is lots of breadth, lots of depth. It's the most intimate, it's the highest risk stage. There's a lot of honesty, a lot of intimacy, and a high degree of like spontaneity. So you're not calculating what you disclose. You feel very comfortable just sort of saying whatever's on your mind. And that, of course, can be for better or worse. So it definitely increases the layer of intimacy, but of course, it's also the layer at which you stop thinking about strategically how you reveal yourself, and that can, of course, cause people who are close to you to want to what we call de-invest or de-penetrate. So the movement back out toward the layers, because it is, there's kind of a cost benefit to disclosing personal information or revealing your most comfortable self. So one of the principles of this whole entire process as you're thinking about your own interpersonal communication is this norm of reciprocity. And it's the idea that as I am disclosing deeper layers of self, or if I'm staying on this shallow outer layer, that you're going to roughly match me. So if you've ever heard of this concept of like nonverbal mirroring, we often think it means like if I cross my arms, you cross your arms. It's not exactly right because that stuff is really hard to control. But one version of nonverbal mirroring is to meet me at the layer of disclosure that I'm at. And likewise, if you have a relationship that you want to become more intimate, you need to slightly push the layers of disclosure to get people to match you through the norm of reciprocity. But of course, if someone is out here disclosing at a very superficial layer and you're trying to disclose at a very deep layer, that mismatch, generally speaking, is not going to work well for you. Also, the other thing I like to point out is that we often think of this model as a verbal communication model, meaning the way you disclose information is through saying things or revealing things about yourself, like in a verbal form, so telling secrets or whatever. But there's like a disclosure orientation that happens through verbal communication, which is the disclosure of information about you. But then there's also like task orientation. So some people deepen their layers of connection by increasing their risk or vulnerability in their related tasks. So for example, if I am a person who's highly conscious of what I eat, and when we're at the outer layers, the exploratory affective layer or the very, very outer layer, I like to pick all the restaurants and have a lot of control because I don't trust that you're going to be able to meet my dietary needs. If at a certain point I say to you, hey, why don't you go ahead and pick the restaurant? I haven't necessarily disclosed information about myself, but I've brought us into a level of task exchange that requires a lot more depth, a lot more risk, a lot more intimacy. And you then, of course, being able to find a restaurant that suits my needs shows that your norm of reciprocity, that you've met me at that level. So don't miss your opportunity to connect deeply with people who maybe are not verbal communicators to the degree that you are. Likewise, if you're not a verbal communicator, you can use task orientation as a way to match people and deepen relationships. But just remember that people may not perceive that that's what you're doing, so you're always going to have to manage that tension. But we don't want to miss the way that different people might exchange and try to information and try to create relationships just because we're biased toward people who talk. instead of people who share tasks.